Welcome back, everyone, to the Dust Bowl landscape of Depression America, one of our Week 10 lectures focusing on specific regional landscapes of the United States during the Great Depression era. Across 100 million acres of land in half a dozen states or more came the ecological crisis of the 1930s known as the Dust Bowl, when years of drought brought on an ecological and human disaster across the states now of the Midwest and Southwest, from Kansas and eastern Colorado, across western Oklahoma, northern Texas, and even into New Mexico. The weather map here shows the areas that were affected by lower annual averages of rainfall in the 1930s than had been the case in the decades preceding. And thus it was that this area took on the popular nickname of the Dust Bowl. Not always known as a Dust Bowl, nevertheless it was once considered to be a great desert. That is, by English-speaking residents of the U.S. In the 1800s, who, when they looked west across their maps to what was then an unsettled territory by the United States, saw it as a region perhaps not fit for regular human habitation. I say regular because in the minds of many native-born English-speaking Protestant, Christian, Anglo-Americans living east of the Mississippi River, it was the aridity, that is, the relatively low annual rainfall of some of these western territories, that made it not so attractive for future migration, except in the case of Indian removal, which commenced in the U.S. in the 1820s and 1830s during the presidential administration of Andrew Jackson. The forced removal of native peoples from the southeast, including the Cherokee people, on what comes to be known to history as the Trail of Tears. The designated destination for those people, those native peoples, was the so-called Indian Territory of the West, what would later become the Oklahoma Territory. At the time designated Indian Territory in a territorial claim by the United States as a reservation lands for those tribal peoples, those native peoples, including the Cherokee, who were forced by the U.S. government, along with the U.S. military, to see them relocated in the lands that most native English-speaking people considered to be nearly worthless. Nevertheless, in the decades that followed, white people's hunger for land changed all of that, as a stretch of wet winters seemed to teach the old farmers' homespun wisdom that, quote, rain follows the plow. Beginning with the Homestead Act in 1862, that is during the U.S. Civil War, when Congress designated tens of millions of acres of western land, designated that land for sale to homesteading farmers for pennies on the acre. That western land would come to include large parts of the previously designated Indian Territory, which would now be redesignated as settler territory, much of it settlers' territory, by the U.S. government. And in 1889, the famous Oklahoma land rush saw eager settlers scurrying about the Oklahoma Territory, trying to stake their claims within the allotted time to cheap homesteads. Homesteads that had previously been part of the designated Indian Territory, which, as we said at the time, it was established in the 1830s, was seen as mostly worthless by whites living in the East. But all of that changes with the Homestead Act and later the Oklahoma Land Rush, as population pressures, growing numbers of immigrants in the East, all of them hungry for white homesteads, that is, to be settled by white farm families in the West, in territories that now included the Oklahoma Territory. And this adage, this old farmer's adage that rain follows the plow, seemed to be borne out in the late 1800s, early 1900s, by annual rainfall totals in the Oklahoma region and throughout that part of the West. Annual rainfall totals that could amply support the arrival of white farming. As the president of Oklahoma's State Board of Agriculture wrote in 1907, agriculture is and will be for years to come, if not forever, the leading industry of our state. So having been now organized from a territorial possession to a state with membership in the Union, that is, the arrival of Oklahoma as a new state to the Union in 1907, its Board of Agriculture announcing that in effect Oklahoma was open to business for those who wished to farm. And thus, not surprisingly, agriculture took off in the early 1900s in Oklahoma. The federal census reported that in Oklahoma between 1890 and 1900 alone, the number of farms had increased from just under 9,000 to 108,000 farms. And Oklahoma farmers produced a long list and wide variety of crops, which you see here, including corn, cotton, winter wheat, oats, maize, potatoes, on down the line. Oklahoma farmers also produced and sold poultry, including dairy products like eggs and cheese and butter, as well as a variety of other garden and orchard products. So what had once been designated by whites to be a great desert, and only then turned over to resettled native peoples forcibly evacuated from their tribal lands in the East as an Indian territory, following the Homestead Act in the 1860s and then the Oklahoma Land Rush with cheap land sales in the 1890s. It seemed the land had been transferred, or transformed, I should say, into a type of farmer's paradise. And so it seemed for the first couple of decades of the 20th century, but alas, Mother Nature had different ideas, and by the 1930s, the abundant rains seemed to come to an end. That is, Mother Nature, it seemed, turned off the tap, and low annual rainfall totals began to transform the landscape once again in reverse, from a farmer's paradise now into what would be known as the Dust Bowl. At the time, it was seen as an extended and severe drought, which had caused crops to fail all across the Southwest, leaving the plowed fields exposed to wind erosion. The fine soil of the Great Plains, the southern plains, was easily eroded and carried aloft in the atmosphere eastward by strong continental winds. Immense dust storms swept across the Southwest throughout the 1930s, in places like Elkhart, Kansas, or the so-called black rollers, or in Stratford, Texas, where the so-called black blizzards, these were colloquial terms given to the overwhelming clouds of dust, swept up off the plains, carried by the winds, creating havoc, really, as you can see here, natural disasters, turning that farmer's landscape into a nightmare. A black blizzard over Prowers County, Colorado leaves only a single country road and a farmer's truck beating a hasty retreat. The songwriter and singer Woody Guthrie will pen a whole songbook of so-called Dust Bowl ballads, giving voice to the disastrous turn of things in the 1930s. This photograph showing a dust storm over Amarillo, Texas in 1935. By 1935, the Dust Bowl covered over 100 million acres, and Guthrie composed his Dust Bowl ballads while living and traveling throughout much of that region. Woody Guthrie recalled that the dust storms felt like doomsday itself, writing in his memoir Bound for Glory, "This dust blowing so thick you can't breathe, can't see the sky, that's the scourge over the face of the earth." "I looked at their hair," wrote Guthrie, "and it was dry, windblown, gritty, and full of the dust out of the storm, and not any certain wave or color, just the color of the whole country. I had seen thousands of men that looked just the same way and could usually tell by the color of the dirt where they were from." A landscape of dust that gave way to not only the songs of singers, folk singers, country singers like Woody Guthrie, but also some of the nation's finest writers, including John Steinbeck, who had begun writing a series of dispatches for the newspaper, reporting from the Dust Bowl before turning his stories into one of the landmark novels of age, of course, The Grapes of Wrath. "Men and women huddled in their houses," wrote Steinbeck, "and they tied handkerchiefs over their noses when they went out and wore goggles to protect their eyes." Steinbeck writes, "The dust from the roads fluffed up and spread out and fell on the weeds besides the fields. Little by little the sky was darkened by the mixing dust, and the wind fell over the earth, loosened the dust, and carried it away." Houses were shut tight and cloth wedged around doors and windows. But the dust came in so thinly that it could not be seen in the air, and it settled like pollen on the chairs and tables, on the dishes. For many, the battle with nature was simply too great. "Where you heading?" "California," I said. "Hustling out of this damn dust. Far piece down the road, ain't it? Into this damn highway, and I ain't a-looking back." "Ain't a-looking back," exclaimed one of the characters in Woody Guthrie's memoir, Bound for Glory. The story of how the peoples of Oklahoma and Texas, Colorado, Kansas, Arkansas, losing their farms to foreclosure, unable to produce a profitable crop, set out on the roads, east to Chicago, St. Louis, west on Highway 66, the famous Route 66 that led to California. In these years of the 30s, it was common to see families driving in caravans with all their earthly belongings packed tightly and tied down on trailers and rooftops and flatbeds, parked along the side of the roads, throwing down a blanket, eating a bit of lunch, or waiting for the engine to cool and adding water to the radiator. This phenomenon would come to be called the Okie migration. And it was spurred by the handbills and flyers and posters touting California as a genuine Garden of Eden. The world turned into such a thick green garden of fruits and vegetables that I didn't know if I was dreaming or not, writes Guthrie in Bound for Glory. Maybe we can start again in the new rich land in California where the fruit grows. We'll start over, said a character in The Grapes of Wrath. Yeah, Tom said, there is a whole country moving. We're moving too. A California reporter noticed the OK on license plates from Oklahoma, referred to the people in the cars as Okies, and soon the term was used to refer to all California-bound Dust Bowl migrants, no matter the state from which they had come. The Dust Bowl exodus was the largest migration in American history within a short period of time. By 1940, 2.5 million people had moved out of the Plains states. And it was this migration, as I say, depicted in books and movies alike, most famously The Grapes of Wrath, the prize-winning novel by John Steinbeck, told the story of an American family's migration, the Joad family, from the Dust Bowl to California during the Great Depression. Like so many, the Joads had lost their family farm to the dust in Oklahoma. And the novel and subsequent movie, based on this fictional family story, became emblematic for an entire generation of Americans, not only those who were affected by the Dust Bowl, but those who read about it in the pages of Steinbeck's novel or watched it on the big screen. It was the actor Henry Fonda who depicted the central character, Tom Joad, in the Academy Award-winning movie, The Grapes of Wrath. Depicted also in song and story in Woody Guthrie's Dust Bowl ballads. Guthrie was born in Okemah, Oklahoma in 1912 and traveled through the Dust Bowl years and Depression years with migrant workers from Oklahoma to California and learned the traditional folk and blues songs of those he met. Many of his songs are about his experiences and the people he met along the way. Guthrie tried hard to correct the impression that California was a Garden of Eden, that California was an answer to everyone's problems. This is an idea made popular not only in the handbills and flyers and posters of the age, but also in the popular culture by singers such as Jimmie Rodgers, whose popular Blue Yodel Number 4 told of a place where you could sleep out every night, California. Rodgers came to be called the father of country music. But to Woody Guthrie's way of thinking, his songs did people no favor by painting California as a paradise, what you might call the California dreamin' imagery of the 1930s. But I like to think how it's nice, how nice it's gonna be maybe in California, says one of the characters in Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath. Never cold, and fruit every place, and people just being in the nicest places, little white houses in among the orange trees. I wonder, that is, if we all get jobs and all work, maybe we can get one of them little white houses. Well, it was a dream that died hard for many in California. The familiar sight of the migrant farm worker, his bed and clothes tied into a roll upon his back, hiking, you might say, migrating, hitching a ride, jumping the rails. They came to be known as bindle stiffs. That is, out of work or searching for work, migrant farm workers. This one photographed just outside of Napa in 1938. Woody Guthrie wrote in his memoir, Bakersfield into Fresno. Just this side of Fresno, the men piled off and walked through the yards, planning to meet the train again when it come out the north end. We took off by ones and twos and tried to get hold of something to eat. Some of the men had a few nickels, some had $1 or $2 hit on them, and others made the alleys, knocking on the back doors of bakeries, greasy spoon joints, vegetable stands. The meal added up to a couple or 3 bites apiece after we'd all pitched ours in. It was something to fill your guts. Something to fill your guts, said Guthrie, if you ain't got the do-re-mi. Migrant workers' California reality was different than the California dreamin'. Then about every few feet down the jungle hill you'd walk past a shack just sort of made out of everything in general. Old strips of asphalt tar paper, double gunny sacks, an old dress shirt, pair of overalls stretched up to cover half a side of a wall, bumpy corrugated iron, cement sacks, orange and apple crates took apart and nailed together with old rusty burnt nails from the cinder piles, gunny sacks, old clothes, hay and straw, fermenting bedclothes are usually piled full of kids playing or grown-ups resting and waiting for the word work to come. Here was a photograph taken by Dorothea Lange in the 1936, of a migrant agricultural workers' family in Nipomo, California. Photographers like Lange were actually commissioned by the federal government during the New Deal years and the Works Progress Administration to range the landscape and taking pictures of the folks who they found. Here's a closer-up view of the migrant farm workers. Family, a migrant mother and her children turning away from the camera while a child pulled close to her, an infant child pulled close to her. This picture, this photograph taken by Dorothea Lange went viral, you might say, in the 30s and appeared across the country and even internationally in newspapers and magazines. And it was something about her face, her visage, and her children that captured the imagination of so many, wondering what the life in the Dust Bowl years must have been like. The politics and economics of poverty and hard times landed hard on those seeking work, as the supply of labor often would exceed in any given time and place the farm owners' demand for labor, leaving many more searching for some available labor. As Steinbeck wrote in The Grapes of Wrath, this here fella's got a contract to pick them peaches or chop that cotton. You see now, the more fellas he can get and the hungrier, the less he's going to pay. And he'll get a fella with kids if he can. Steinbeck alluding here to the labor practice of oversupplying a market and thus paying out lower and lower wages to those who are desperate for the work. Pa said, suppose he's telling the truth, that fella. The preacher answered, he's telling the truth all right, the truth for him. He wasn't making nothing up. How about us? Tom demanded. Is that the truth for us? I don't know, said Casey. I don't know, said Pa. Others suggested that the Dust Bowl disaster itself could have been avoided, and in fact was exacerbated by land use policies and practices that denuded the soil and left it vulnerable to erosion. U.S. government's Resettlement Administration paid for a documentary film called The Plow That Broke the Plains by filmmaker Pare Lawrence. Lawrence rejected the Mother Nature argument and instead suggested that man's misuse of the prairies, including over-farming and erosion, destroyed an ecosystem, leading to the Dust Bowl phenomenon, an ecosystem that had long been noted for its aridity and low rainfall totals. Critics of Lawrence charged that the film was propaganda, and angry farm leaders said it unfairly blamed the victims. FDR's New Deal responded with policies and projects to restore the denuded farmlands. Roosevelt ordered the Civilian Conservation Corps to plant a huge belt of more than 200 million trees stretching from Canada to Texas, designed to help reduce soil erosion by increasing water levels in the soil and providing a windbreak. The New Deal undertook educating farmers on soil conservation and paid reluctant farmers $1 an acre to practice new techniques, including crop rotation, contour plowing, terracing, and other improved farming practices. By 1938, the amount of dust in the air was significantly reduced, but only in the fall of '39, when rainfall returned to pre-drought levels, did farmers once again earn a livable, sustainable income. And what of the ghost of Tom Joad? They sat silent in the coal-black cave of vines. Ma said, "How am I going to know about you? They might kill you and I wouldn't know. They might hurt you. How am I going to know?" Tom laughed uneasily. "Well, maybe like Casey says, a fella ain't got a soul of his own, but only a piece of a big one. And then? Then what, Tom? Then it don't matter. Then I'll be around in the dark. I'll be everywhere, wherever you look. Wherever there's a fight so hungry people can eat, I'll be there. Wherever there's a cop beating a guy, I'll be there. I'll be in the way guys yell when they're mad, and I'll be in the way kids laugh when they're hungry and they know supper's ready. And when our folks eat the stuff they raise and live in the houses they build, why, I'll be there." A modern ode to Tom Joad by the singer Bruce Springsteen, along with Tom Morello, who performed the song. Springsteen wrote "The Ghost of Tom Joad," first in Anaheim, California in 2009. Families sleeping in their cars in the Southwest. They sing, "No home, no job, no peace, no rest." You can watch the video of this performance this week in our module. A testament to the ongoing problems of the rural poor, the migrating poor, and the working poor in the United States in the decades since the Great Depression in our own time. Well, that's it. For now, we'll move on to the other lecture on the Mississippi Delta. The two together, as I say, will form a pair of discussions this week on the American landscape during the era of the Great Depression.